Greetings, my name is Ben Prather, and I want to thank you for taking the time to check out this next installment of the 1913 Project, where I talk about FDR, who really stands with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln as one of the three presidents who really had the most significant role in shaping the country that we know. Washington leading and guiding us through the Revolutionary War, and Abraham Lincoln leading and guiding us through the Civil War, two of the biggest transitions in our nation's history. And then finally, FDR really implementing Wilson's dream and leading us and guiding us through the Great Depression and leading to the rise of the Bureaucratic States of America as we know them today. So FDR ran for office in the peak of the Great Depression and ran really opposed to Hubert Hoover, who is seen as being ineffective in really appreciating the magnitude of effort that is going to take to deal with this crisis. So he ran diametrically opposed to that we're going to not only use the federal powers to their fullest, but we're going to expand the federal government to bring even more power to the federal government in order to address this crisis in the most expedient and direct way possible. And so that was his view, although his policies were largely an extension of Woodrow Wilson's vision of building a large bureaucratic federal government that pretty much managed everything and using the crisis in order to build popular support for this idea and overcome the obstacles that were slowing down Wilson's federal expansion. These new policies needed to have an expansion in the number of federal agencies and the power of many existing agencies. This eventually led to the court packing crisis that we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. So let's take a look at the policies that he actually implemented. So one of the first things he did, the very first day actually, was the Emergency Banking Act. And what this did was it created a banking holiday where all the banks were closed. And ostensibly, what was going to happen was all of the banks were going to be audited. And then once the federal government completed the audit and was able to certify that, in fact, everything was on the up and up, and this bank was actually in a good financial position to open back up, and that the people could rely on it, then after that was done, then the banks would reopen and the people could have confidence in their bank. And with the declassification of a lot of the documents from that time, we actually now know that the audits were mostly meaningless. So essentially, they just shut down all the banks, waved their hands like they were doing something, and then opened up all the banks and said, oh yeah, everybody can trust it. But because a lot of it was mass hysteria, it worked because people now had confidence in the banks, and that ended the problem of people not having confidence in the banks. So in some sense, it actually worked. And so I talked about in the last video how prohibition had passed at the end of the previous administration, but it was towards the end of the administration, and any amendment requires some legislation by Congress to actually implement the changes of that amendment. So that bill didn't come to the president's desk until Roosevelt was in office, so he got to sign that at the very beginning of his tenure. Another policy that he pushed for at the very beginning was the Agriculture Adjustment Act. And what this did was there were problems with the farmers were being very productive and producing a huge supply, but then a huge supply drives the prices down. So then farmers were having difficulties with, they were having this huge amount of resources produced that they were not able to sell for enough to cover their costs. So this was causing problems for farmers even being able to stay in business and then being able to produce the following year. So in order to help control the prices, this aimed to limit the supply, and it limited the supply by paying a certain percentage of the farmers to just not grow anything, so then the supply would be reduced, so the prices would stay high, so that the farmers could continue to make money either by the profits off of their crop or through the subsidies that the government was providing. And another action that he pushed at the very beginning was the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was a broad intervention across the entire economy, trying to implement workers' rights at a very aggressive pace. That this was actually the policy that led to the court packing problem that we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. So related to that legislation is the Fair Labor Standards Act, and this really put in place a lot of the ideas that we just take for granted in the hourly work relationship that a lot of people have, which is that there is a federal minimum wage. There's a minimum wage that you must earn more than that, or else your employer is breaking the law. And if you work over 40 hours, you're going to get paid time and a half. This was an innovation of FDR. And it also put in place age restrictions. Like today, when I was growing up at least, you couldn't work until you were 15, most jobs. And then even from 15 to 18, the number of hours that you could work were limited, especially on school nights, to how late you could work. So those type of age restrictions were first put in place by the Fair Labor Standard Act. He also, these are more second-term policy actions, but the Glass-Steagall Act passed during his time, and this really aimed to control the problems that happened with the stock market and with banks going bankrupt, and then the people who had deposits there, their life savings there, losing their life savings when the bank went bankrupt, and then there's money that wasn't there anymore, the money that they had counted on. So to the first thing, it limited the amount that you could borrow to invest in the stock market, and other type regulations to control speculation that led to the stock market crisis that was perceived as starting the Great Depression. And for this latter part, it created the FDIC insurance that protects the first 100,000, maybe more now because of inflation, the first certain amount of deposits that you have in your bank account, that if the bank goes belly up, at least for that amount, you're assured by the federal government that you will be reimbursed for that amount. And towards the end of his second term, he ceased private gold holdings. He made it so that it was technically illegal to own gold. Though that's a little bit hard to implement because you can't really, it would be ineffective to try to seize everybody's gold. But what it did do is it raised the price that the Federal Reserve was willing to pay for gold to encourage people to sell their gold to the bank in order to get a greater amount of cash than they were before. With all of these new policies, he needed to have agencies to implement many of these policies. So this is going to list some of the agencies that were created under FDR, which the first one I'm going to talk about is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which had two sub-agencies under it. The Works Progress Administration, which oversaw projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority was part of this, and the Social Security Administration, which came along a little bit later, but then was put underneath this umbrella organization that really instituted Social Security, did not exist before FDR, and now it is ingrained in our culture. These next two agencies were only temporary. They actually went away about in the time of World War II, and we'll see why after I discuss them. The Public Works Administration, which was designed to keep people busy by building large projects across the country, that with World War II, this was redirected to powering our industrial sector, to build our war machine. And then the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was straight up a jobs program to give people jobs so that they could feel productive in society, but it built basically our national park system was built by this. When you go to a national park, there are these places that are set up for tourists to enjoy and paths through the parks, and a lot of those are really forged during this time with the Civilian Conservation Corps. But with World War II, there was now a new need for the government to have people as soldiers for our Army. So if you were unemployed, congratulations, you're now a soldier for the U.S. Army. And even if you are employed, we're going to put in the draft. So congratulations, whether you like it or not, whether you need it or not, you're now a soldier in the U.S. Army. So those two programs kind of became obsolete once we were focused on fighting World War II. Another agency that he created was, well, these next two he expanded. They already existed, but he expanded the role. The first one is the Reconstruction Finance Court, which previously just bailed out state and local governments and provided loans to the financial sector if they ran into trouble. But he expanded that to basically all aspects of the economy. So it was the PPP that we've had, the payroll protection plan that was put in place last year, really mirrored what this did for the rest of the economy. And he also expanded the Federal Trade Commission, which I discussed how it was created under Woodrow Wilson, but the enactment of the farm subsidies was put under this, as well as with the people having problems with their banks going bankrupt and losing their life savings. This puts some strain, and just a general economic devastation in general. This put pressure on mortgages and people not being able to pay their mortgages and getting into trouble with that. So this provided relief to keep people in their homes who were having troubles with their mortgages. So another agency that FDR created was the Security and Exchange Commission. And what this did was it oversaw the stock market for the first time, because prior to this, the stock market was seen as basically free market, independent agents working out contracts and having their best interest in mind. But with the stock market crash and the risk that this posed to the overall market, is like, no, this poses too much risk to the overall economy that we need to have some kind of checks on that. So we created the Security and Exchange Commission to overlook the trading of commodities. FDR also created the Federal Communications Commission to oversee these new inventions of radio and television and the existing telephone networks, because with radio and TV in particular, there's only so much bandwidth. So you really need to allocate this bandwidth is for this purpose, this bandwidth for this purpose, and all up and down the spectrum. And in particular, keep TV stations from clashing by trying to use the same frequency. They broke the nation up into regions and gave the major networks certain frequencies in certain parts of the country in order to keep the conflicts. So he also created the National Labor Relations Board, which oversaw the right of employers to unionize, which was created at this time. And then it also, with these newly enacted workers' rights, it was the agency that was in charge of helping workers get the protections that they want from these newly created federal laws protecting workers from abusive employment relations. And the last thing I want to talk about what he did was he restructured the executive office of the president, because with all of these new agencies and all the new funds going through all of these agencies and the increased size of government, it was clear that the existing structures where these top level positions would be restructured. Pretty much every president would come in and take care of what needed to be done. That wasn't going to work with the newly expanded scale of the federal government. You really needed to have a more permanent structure that would last for decades, these positions. So it wasn't just changing from term to term, so there'd be some continuity, and there was not an abrupt issue every single time a president was elected. The scale had just become way too big for that type process. So he created the executive office of the president with permanent positions. that's really broken up into three parts. The first part is the White House office, which is called the West Wing, which is physically in the White House, that sees the day-to-day operations of the White House and the Oval Office and the press relations and those type things, that the visible appearances of the president. The second part is the National Security Council, which comprises of the military and intelligence agencies and their professionals who work to advise the president as to foreign relation issues that are going on. If we have wars going on, what's going on in all of the wars, and if there's domestic issues going on, what kind of intelligence is going on that the president needs to be aware of, to keep the president really informed about things outside the White House and all around the world and in our country that the president really needs to be aware of, so that he could, if he's asked about it, he's informed, and when policies come up, he knows what's going on to address them effectively. And the third part of this is the Office of Management and Budget, which with all of these funds coming in through all of these agencies and the money going in all different directions, you really need an office of people to really keep track of where money is going and making sure that the money is actually going to where it was intended and not just, say, disappearing into this one person's pocket over here and then not getting any farther to where it was intended to go. So one thing from FDR's tenure as president that's been in the news a little bit lately is his plan to pack the Supreme Court. So I want to look a little bit at what was going on that led to him proposing this idea and needing to have this idea in the first place in order to get his New Deal policies passed. And so the issue is, up until this point in our history, the Supreme Court largely viewed its role as limiting the expansion of federal power, and in particular, the freedom of contract principle, which is the idea that citizens and companies as independent agents with their own interests in mind could seek out and draw up contracts that are in their interest, and then parties would only agree to contracts that are in their mutual interest. So it really wasn't, the Supreme Court did not view it as the government's role to really interfere with the right of independent free agents from being able to agree to mutually beneficial contracts. And in particular, with FDR's policies, the National Industrial Recovery Act was seen as an infringement on this freedom of contract principle that had established precedent in our tradition up until this point. And so they overturned that law. And FDR was greatly upset at this because he saw it as a beginning of the unwinding of a lot of his other policies. So he pushed for Congress to give him a bill that would basically add 4 more justices to the Supreme Court that he could then appoint immediately. And then there would be enough justices with the ones that were already in support of the New Deal on the Supreme Court that there would be no problems with the New Deal policies, and the Supreme Court would just allow them all to go through without any issues. But Congress, to their credit, did not support this. They viewed that would create a constitutional crisis, and that they did not want to have on their hands. So they actually rejected FDR's proposal there. But they were able to find a workaround in that at that time there was no retirement plan for chief justices. If you retire, or for justices at all, if you retired from the federal courts, then that was it. You were done with the federal courts. You had no more pay. There was no pension. You just had to live off of what you had saved until that point. And the judges and the the federal judges weren't paid as much as they were now, to where it'd be rather straightforward to put aside some savings. So what Congress did was they created a pension for retired justices. So if a justice wanted to retire, then they could retire and their needs would be taken care of. There would be money to provide for them for the rest of their life, however long they lived. And there was one particularly poor justice who decided to take them up on that offer, Van Ventner, who he was one of the conservative justices opposed to the New Deal. So as soon as that bill was passed, basically, he retired, and then FDR was able to appoint one pro-New Deal justice. And then usually in a midterm election, the balance of power goes against the president, but FDR with his New Deal policies were extremely popular because people were starting to get out of this Great Depression and feeling directly the benefits of these policies. So he actually gained support for his New Deal policy. So there's the next Congress for the second half of his first term was even more pro-New Deal. And so there was slightly more likelihood that if there was a need to pack the courts, that it could be approved. And there was a justice named Sutherland who really didn't want to be a part of the undoing of the precedent that he had set for his tenure. So after that wave in the midterm elections, he decided to follow suit and retired, allowing FDR another justice, which pretty much sealed the Supreme Court as being a pro-New Deal entity. All in all, FDR would end up appointing 8 associate justices and 1 chief justice. Some of those were to replace appointments that he made, so he didn't get to completely fill the court. But he dramatically shifted the position of the court in that it went from being viewing itself as having a role to limit the expansion of the federal government and protect the right of the agency of citizens and companies to be able to agree to contracts to their mutual benefit, to one that largely supported the expansion of federal government into all aspects of our society, and being able to limit the types of contracts that people could enter into. For each of the previous administrations I have talked about in previous episodes, I've talked a little bit about the foreign policy directions that they took. And so I want to do the same thing with FDR. So one of the themes that I've been going on is, with the Monroe Doctrine, looking at Latin America, and FDR continued the trend of the Republican presidents before him of reducing our footprint in Latin America. And in fact, Cuba and Panama were not quite territories, but under our purview. And FDR actually granted them their independence, so they then became independent nations. Congress at that time was largely isolationist, and FDR didn't address that at all. He pretty much just acquiesced to that. There's some indicators that he wanted to be more involved with the World War II, but he wasn't. He was too busy dealing with the domestic issues to really worry about anything going on overseas, especially since there would have been opposition in Congress. Of course, this changed in his third term in 1941 when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. Although sentiment for World War II was actually started to grow when France was invaded in the late 1940. This started to build public sentiment for, okay, perhaps Germany has gone a step too far, that maybe we should start doing something. And then when we were attacked on Pearl Harbor in 1941, that was it. We were in the war. We were attacked. That was an act of war against us. We could no longer stand on the side. We had to defend ourselves. So the World War II really shaped his foreign policy for the rest of his tenure. finally ending shortly after he died. So I want to conclude today's episode by really just recapping a little bit of the high points of FDR's viewpoints and impact on the development of our country. And there's a pervasive thought that the government innocuously expands its power by a crisis will come, and then the federal government will then, in response to this crisis, then expand its powers to deal with that crisis, and then they just don't give back these powers that were initially intended to be temporary. They just kind of become fixed as permanent, and that's how federal government kind of creeps along. That is not what happened with FDR. With FDR, these policies were, he was a supporter of these policies when Woodrow Wilson was president, and he really had the vision of a bureaucratic states of America even before there was a Great Depression. And what he did was he seized on the Great Depression and the crisis to produce an impetus in the country so that his idea and his vision could be created and built in response to a crisis that emerged at that time, a significant crisis that needed to be dealt with. And he campaigned on it, and he said, these are the promises that I'm doing. So he was fulfilling his campaign promises. The people voted, this is what the people voted for. So it's what our country got, because we wanted the rise of the bureaucratic states of America in the form of FDR's New Deal. He also shifted the Supreme Court from being a body that primarily limited the expansion of government and kept the federal government to a strict interpretation of its constitutional boundaries to one that allowed for an extremely expanding role of the federal government into all aspects of our society. And in World War II, he built a war machine, an industrial scale war machine, that with the destruction that happened to every other industrialized nation, at the end of World War II, we were left as really the only unscathed industrial power, and with a huge, massive military infrastructure that was unrivaled by anyone else in the world at that point in our history, that really set the stage for global politics for certainly the next few decades, and arguably all the way up through where we are today. So with that, I would like to thank you for taking the time to hear what I have to say in this edition of the 1913 Project, and welcome you to join me at the 1913project.locals.com, where I'm want to build a community where I can get your feedback on perhaps mistakes that I've made, or things that I have overlooked that perhaps I should go into more detail on when I actually work this out in its written form, and encourage you to see what else may be posted, other topics of interest that I post on my YouTube channel, The Ultra Crepidarian, where I do have a playlist of all of these, which is probably where you're at now. And yeah, I just want to thank you for your part in this community at the 1913project.locals.com. So the first thing he did when